I read someone once say that once suffering is completely accepted, it ceases, in a sense, to be suffering. And I think there's some truth there. That in some ways, it's the time of waiting, anticipating the suffering or trial that can be worse than the trial itself. Because knowing the very real impending possibility of going through some immense physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual pain even creates intense distress and anxiety. It's one of the most intense human experiences known to us. A man's heart races as he stands trial before a judge and jury after days of deliberations and cross-examinations, the evidence presented, anxiously awaiting the verdict of each jury member as they rise and issue it one by one. A wife whose husband is on active duty, serving in the Middle East, sits at home and stares at the phone, waiting for a call and wondering if it'll be the one she's been praying and hoping every single day that she would never receive. An expectant mother and her husband in the waiting room as they await further test results, checking their baby's health, who she has barely felt move over the past few days. A husband and his wife waiting for the doctor's report, the surgeon's biopsy after years of battling cancer and already experiencing the grueling ordeal of radiation and chemotherapy. Has the cancer spread? I can't bear another round of chemo or radiation. Or is it too late and there's nothing more the doctors can do? And my friends, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus too waits. He waits for the hour that he has been moving towards his entire life on earth. He waits for what he has predicted several times now to his disciples must happen: his rejection, his betrayal, his abandonment, his suffering, and ultimately his death. He waits for the betrayer to arrive at any moment and hand him over to the chief priests that will effectively seal his fate and from which there will be no turning back. And Jesus is anxious beyond anything he's ever experienced, filled with dread, grief, sorrow, even terror, as he anticipates the horrors of the events that are about to unfold in his life. And in his humanity, he contemplates if just for a moment there's another way to accomplish his mission to reconcile sinners back to God, the salvation of the world, for a God to whom all things are possible, as he throws himself on the ground before God, prostrate and in prayer. And what we see here revealed as in no other place in the Bible is the humanity of Jesus, who is not only fully and truly God, but he is fully and truly man, human, who experiences the full range of human emotions more intensely than any other human being who has ever lived or ever will. He is greatly distressed, troubled, filled with grief, sorrowful, anxious, stressed, pressed down, lonely, dejected, rejected, even tested, and yes, even tempted. And yet, in spite of what he knows lies ahead, in spite of the crushing anxiety and stress that he experiences in his body, in the depths of his entire being, crushing his soul, he yields to the will of the Father in perfect, humble submission. And he does this because he knows it is God's plan from eternity to rescue and redeem sinners, and there is no other way but by pouring out his life to death in their place on the cross. He willfully accepts and obeys God. And in so doing, models the highest and purest example of humble and faithful and obedient submission to God's will and plan for your life. So that no matter what lies ahead, no matter how severe the suffering, no matter how great the trial, you must continue trusting that God has a plan and a purpose in it, and humbly accept it as His will for your life, just as Jesus did, and know that God will carry you through, just as He did His only begotten Son, Jesus. And that's part of what we're going to see in this story as we pick it up in verse 32. They had just finished the Last Supper, which we saw that Jesus amazingly elevates even to another level beyond a physical earthly deliverance of Israel and the Passover. Besides that kind of a commemoration, as He inaugurates a new covenant in His life, in His body, His being, His blood, represented in the elements of the table, and He transforms the Last Supper into the Lord's Supper, which He commands those who come to Him in faith and believe in Him to do in remembrance of Him and of the new covenant which He inaugurates in His life, given for us. And that celebratory meal quickly turns to a somber meal, as Jesus predicts that one of them will betray Him. And the meal begins at 6 p.m. from sundown to midnight. And after that, they begin a trek to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place that had become a place of solace and prayer and retreat for Jesus during His ministry. And on their way there, as if it's not bad enough with all the disciples, the 12, contemplating which one of them is it that would betray Him, Jesus says, not only will one of you betray me, but all of you will desert me. You'll all abandon me. In the hour of my greatest need, you're going to leave me all alone. And they can't believe it. One by one also denying this, especially the brazen bravado of Peter, the chief of the 12, who stands up and says, even if these weak clowns do, I will never abandon you, Jesus. I will follow you even to death. And Jesus says, Peter, Peter, before the rooster crows twice this night, you will deny me 3 times. And then they finally arrive. Verse 32, at the garden, where Peter and the 12 evidently, or 3 at least, have a chance to put their faith on display. Verse 32, and they went to a place called Gethsemane, and He said to His disciples, sit here while I pray. And He took with Him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. So they get to Gethsemane. From John's Gospel in chapter 18, verse 1, we know that it's a garden. He calls it the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane just comes from the Hebrew root word, which is transliterated in the Greek here, meaning oil press or presses of olives. And we're not surprised by that. It's where the Mount of Olives is, and Jesus delivers one of His most famous discourses, right? The Olivet Discourse. It's an olive garden, if you will. On the Mount of Olives, on the western slope, about 2 miles outside of the city, east of Jerusalem, and they arrive. One of His favorite places to retreat, for quiet, for prayer, and for direct communion to God, especially knowing the impending suffering that He's about to endure. And He gets there, and He says to His disciples, you sit here while I pray. He tells them, at least 9 of them, to sit here while I go pray. And then He uniquely, selectively chooses Peter, James, and John to go further, deeper into the garden with Him, while the other 9 remain. Interesting. He seems to have had a kind of special affinity for these three, didn't he? If you read and are familiar with the life and ministry of Jesus, in Mark 5, it's these three that he uniquely allows to come into the room as he heals Jairus' daughter and actually raises her from the dead while the others remain outside. On the Mount of Transfiguration in chapter 9, it's these three alone that he takes up with him, and he unveils his glory, the glory of God, which was previously covered in his human flesh, and he peels it back, and it's these three that get that awesome revelatory glimpse of Jesus' glory as God. And here, in the garden, it's these three. Does Jesus have a special relationship and affection for them? Evidently. But I think there's another reason why he chooses these three to accompany him further now into the garden. Don't forget, it was Peter who, a few moments or hours earlier, as they're walking to the garden, stands up and separates himself from the pack and says, even if they desert you, I'll never follow away. Not me. I'm better than that. I'm better than them. And then don't forget, James and John did the same thing not too long as they were on their way to Jerusalem in Jesus' final trek here as he gets to the Passion Week. In chapter 10, they say, make us a promise, Jesus, that when you get into your kingdom, we'll each be sitting on your right and on your left hand, the chief seats of power in your kingdom. We deserve it. We're better than the rest. Remember how Jesus responded then? Really? Are you prepared to drink the cup of suffering that I'm prepared to drink and to undergo the baptism of fiery trial that I must undergo? Yes, yes, Lord, we are. We're better than the rest. Our faith is stronger. We're more powerful spiritually. And Jesus says, very well, and so you shall. And so I think that's why perhaps he brings these three, who in their minds are better than the rest, to put their supposed and self-styled superior faith to the test. So he brings them in deeper in the garden. And he brings them in, and notice how Jesus describes what he's experiencing. He takes with him Peter and James and John, and it says, he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. The idea behind these words is he is filled with utter dread and horror, filled with anxiety. This description here of how Jesus is feeling is unparalleled in all of the Gospels or anywhere else in the Bible. This is a deep-seated grief and distress and pressure. In fact, don't take Mark's word for it. Look at Jesus' own words as he moves to the first person in verse 34. And Jesus says to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. He's saying, my soul is so overwhelmed with sorrow, with grief, with anxiety, that if I have just a little bit more, it's going to crush me to death. I can barely hang on. That's the intensity of the emotional and spiritual and physical anticipation that Jesus has in this moment. So much so that he reaches for the words of the psalmist in Psalm 42, 5 and 6, and Psalm 43, 5, my soul is sorrowful even to death, quoting the psalmist there. It's disturbing to read. It's disturbing to hear. This is Jesus, the God-man. Why is he so troubled? Why is he so broken? Good questions. It's a good question to ask. Because we don't have to see this side of Jesus in the Gospels, do we? His humanity. Because you need to remember, he was truly and fully God, but he was also truly and fully man. And here you see the frailty of the human nature that he added to himself when he came down to earth to be born of a virgin and took on human flesh. Why is he so troubled to the depths of his soul, so that an ounce more and it'll crush him to death? It's what he knows is about to happen to him. Is it the horrific scourging that he's about to endure at the hands of the Romans with massive whips, with spikes and rocks and metal and lead attached to the end that'll completely shred open his back, his front, and wherever they can strike him with lacerations 12 to 14 inches long and 1.5 inches deep? Absolutely. Is it the crown of thorns that'll be impressed deep into his skull and create an intense amount of bleeding, knowing how many nerve endings there are on the skull? Absolutely. Is it the 7 and 9 inch nails that they're about to drive into his wrists and into his ankles as they fasten him to the cross and he hangs there for 6 hours? Absolutely. Is it the excruciating pain of trying to push himself up with his nail-driven-in ankles just to get a quick breath of air because his lungs are collapsed and his shredded back is rubbing up against the rough timber of the upright of the cross? Absolutely. But I want to submit something else to you this morning. That as horrific as the physical injuries and suffering that Jesus endured, that is not the sole reason that is crushing his soul almost to death as he anticipates what lies before him. It is the understanding that for the first time in his eternal existence as the Son of God, who's enjoyed nothing but perfect unity and love and reciprocal communion within the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit, who has experienced nothing but the pleasure of the Father, the love of the Father, the approval of the Father, the acceptance of the Father, and now for the first time, he's going to experience what it feels like to be alienated from the love and communion of the Father as he's separated from him in that moment, as he bears the world's sin, and he himself, in a sense, becomes sin for the world, as Paul says, and he's cut off from God, and God turns his face from him, so much so that he cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It is the understanding that he's going to experience what it is like to be totally cut off from God, and that thought is almost unbearable and nearly crushes his humanity to death. Because he, more than anyone, as God, understands God's perfect justice and his holiness and the standard that he expects, and how all human beings were plunged into sin from Genesis 3, and they're under the judgment of God, and he understands the wrath and judgment and justice of God as God. He knows what's coming. He knows what that's going to feel like. And he must experience it all in himself. The entire fury and wrath and justice and judgment of God against sin for all sinners everywhere that would ever come, past, present, and future, in those 6 hours on the cross, exhausted and executed, aimed squarely at him. This is terrifying. Even for Jesus. Even for Jesus. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. So as he comes in a little further now he tells Peter and James and John also to take a seat and watch. It's a term that comes up a lot at the end of his life and ministry in the Olivet Discourse. He's telling his disciples in the parable of the servants and the master who left the house in Mark 13, watch, be watchful, be watchful. And the idea of this, to be watchful, is to be faithful, is to be prayerful, it's to be awake, it's to be alert. To be awake, not to be woke. Big difference. It's to be ready, to be faithful. If you're watchful, you're faithful, you're ready. And for everything that may come your way in life, everything that God may determine to purpose for your life that is according to his will, the suffering, the times of good, the times of abundance, the time of lack, whatever comes your way, but especially the idea with this word is be watchful for his coming because he's coming again. Be ready is the idea. Be ready. And he's telling them also now, be ready. You special three who said you've had faith better than the rest, stay here, watch, and be ready. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And so now he goes farther. And notice the vivid language. He throws himself on the ground, face first, and now he begins to pray to the Father. It's unlike our kind of public prayers, isn't it? We're used to kind of sitting quietly, appropriately, or standing up. Maybe we raise our hands. We might say a few things in a whisper that no one might hear, the deep things and secrets of our heart. That's fine. That has a place. It's normal. It was normal even in Jesus' day. The Jews' normal posture and position of prayer was to be standing up with their arms up, right? Praying to God, bowing their head, looking up, and asking the Father. And that was normal. But in intense situations, especially of suffering, they had a habit of prostrating themselves on the ground, face first, in reverence, holy reverence to God, as they put their supplications and petitions before him. And this is the exact posture that Jesus takes now as he feels the weight of the burden of the judgment of God that he's about to endure. It compels him to the ground for him to plead to the Father. If possible. All things are possible for you. He knows all things are possible for God. He's been teaching the disciples the same, right? All things are possible with God. We know that famous line, even in Mark 10. And you see his humanity. And then, not only that, Mark gives us Jesus' own words. And the content of his prayer is the only time in his entire gospel. He moves to the first person in verse 36, and he gives us Jesus' own words, the content of his prayers, as Jesus bows down on the ground before God, and he says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Abba, transliteration of a form of the word Father in Hebrew. And it tells us uniquely something about the relationship that Jesus well understood between him and God. It was his Father. He well knows he's the Son. He's been hinting at this his entire ministry. Disciples have been blind and dull to it. The religious leaders and Pharisees understood his claims as much. Even in John 5:18, we saw that. They knew he was claiming equality with God when he called him his Father. This is blasphemous. This is outrageous. Nobody, no Jewish person in that day would ever call God their Father. That was to claim equality with God, and that was blasphemous to them. But Jesus did because he is. He didn't hesitate to constantly refer to God in heaven as his Father, Abba. All things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. And you can't see this part, just how intense this prayer session is between him and the Father. To see the full intensity of this, you got to go to Luke chapter 20, verse 44. And when you go there, what you start to see is Jesus is praying so intensely, the weight of this anxiety and the stress about the upcoming horrors of the cross and the judgment of God on the cross are so troubling to him, so pressing him down, crushing his soul almost to death, that he begins to sweat great droplets of blood, Luke says. This is no exaggeration. This is a very real but rare medical condition called hematidrosis, where someone, it's only been documented a handful of times after the 20th century, and it happens when someone is under such intense stress, physical, emotional, psychological, what have you. The stress is so intense that the normal course of the bodily and physiological function of sweat being pushed through your glands, something else happens. The capillaries explode and they begin to be engorged, and they explode with blood instead of water and sweat. And they come out of your pores. And Luke says this is what happens to him. That's how pressed down he is. No doubt that's why in Luke's version also you see there that God sends to him an angel to minister to him, to strengthen him, because he's this close to death, and without extra divine strengthening from God above, he'll die under the weight of the pressure that's upon his shoulders before the appointed time, and he can't because he must make it to the cross. He must. This is intense. And another thing you see here, again, is just the humanity of Jesus. Right? Like we like to emphasize his divinity, and rightfully so. To understand Jesus rightly, you must understand him biblically, and the biblical portrait of Jesus is that he is fully God. He is God in essence and nature and attributes. The eternal Son of God, the Word of God, who existed in eternity and enjoyed all the attributes and prerogatives of God, worship, all-powerful, omnipotence, all-knowing, omniscience, and every other attribute. And he comes down to earth and he adds to himself a human nature. That's also key. Though he is fully and truly divine in God, he is also fully and truly man. He had to be. And we don't like to talk about that a lot so as not to sort of be irreverent about him and emphasize that. But you see this at certain points throughout his ministry. But here, unlike no other point in his life or in the Bible, is Jesus' humanity, his humanness, the human nature that he bore on full display. That's what's happening here. Absolutely on full display. And to be clear, it was not his godness, his divine nature that was weak and crumbling and about to fail under the pressure of the impending judgment and horrors he would endure. No. It was his human nature. His human nature. A big difference there. And again, he had to have both. He had to be God in order to be the acceptable substitute in our place, because only God is capable of living a life without sin, and Jesus did it. Yet he also had to be man and take on a human nature, because it was the human nature that sinned and needed to be punished and take the penalty for God's judgment and need to be redeemed. And it's important to say also that Jesus' human nature was sinless. Right? He was fully God and fully man, but his humanity was sinless. It was untouched, untainted by the corrupting effects of sin, unlike ours. Right? We are born into sin. We're born through ordinary generation. Male, female, mom, dad come together. Not so with Jesus. He was supernaturally conceived. So anyone who would try to take that away from him is misinformed. No, he was not born through ordinary generation. He was conceived supernaturally by God the Holy Spirit in the womb of a virgin. His humanity is not like ours. And so he contemplates for a second, for a moment, if this cup, to the God with whom all things are possible, might perhaps pass from him. And it's upon that ground, the omnipotence of God who can do all things, that Jesus in his humanity appeals to. And it's hard for us to understand just how the two natures of Jesus Christ united. The two natures of the Son of God, both divine and human, in the single real person in time and history of Jesus Christ. We don't understand exactly how that can work. Part of that is a mystery to us, the relationship between the two and how Jesus at times displayed his divinity in his life and ministry, and at other times, like here, his humanity, but it is nevertheless true. But what's not a mystery is that this momentary weakness, this crippling anxiety, this dread, even contemplation of another way, it's not coming from his divinity, it's coming from his humanity, because that's exactly what humans and what happens to us in moments of suffering and intense emotion, isn't it? It's typical of us human beings. This is what happens to us. It's what always happens to us. Which means Jesus knows and understands exactly how you feel in every moment and in every situation of your life. The trials, the sorrows, the sufferings, the brokenness, all of it. He gets us. And I don't just mean like that embarrassingly weak sauce Super Bowl ad that wasted tens of millions of dollars and would have better been spent elsewhere. But he truly does get us, much more than they were able to capture in those short, pithy, 30-second woke pictures of Jesus. Listen to how much the writer of Hebrews tells us he gets us. Look at Hebrews 2, verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Propitiation means satisfaction, full satisfaction in our place for the sins. So he had to become like us, that he could make full satisfaction for God and become our faithful high priest. And because he suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. You flip a page to chapter 4, and he says that even more explicitly. Look at chapter 4, verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And you need to be encouraged by that this morning. Jesus was tempted in every single way as you and I could ever be tempted as, yet he was without sin. He resisted the temptation fully, who endured the suffering perfectly and obediently to God, and therefore we can go to him and prostrate prayer before the throne of grace and find mercy in the time of our greatest need. He says, so go to him. If you're suffering, go to him. If you're hurting, go to him. If you're anxious and stressed and the pressures of life are weighing you in from every angle, go to him. He gets you. He does get us, but in a far more infinitely powerful way than most people understand. And we can be sure of that, the writer of Hebrews says, because he knows what it's like to bear a human nature. He was here. And every single moment of his life, he obeyed and he endured perfectly. He truly gets us. And we can go to him. And we must go to him. You even see this in Hebrews 5:7, this whole scene, by the way. When it says Jesus falls prostrate and is crying out to the Father. That's what they did in those kinds of prayers. You see, why would the Son of God need to be wailing and crying? That's what they would do in those moments of intense suffering and prayer. Listen to what the writer of Hebrews also says in chapter 5, verse 7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. What is he talking about here? He's talking about the garden. He's talking about Gethsemane. He did that. He did that. And notice in that language, in Hebrews, and what you see here, even though that word perhaps isn't used, it's Jesus was tempted. He was tempted. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. In every way as we are, yet without sin. And we indeed know from reading the Gospels that he was tempted, wasn't he? By Satan. At the outset of his ministry. After the Holy Spirit comes upon him at his baptism and his ministry officially launches, he immediately is driven into the desert by the Spirit of God to experience the temptation that he might resist it in our place. For 40 days and 40 nights as he's fasting, and Satan comes to him and he attacks him right where he thinks he's the weakest in his human nature. Oh, you've been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. You must be hungry. Why don't you go ahead and turn these stones to bread? Oh, you're the Son of God? You're the Son of God as he takes him to the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem? Then why don't you just throw yourself from here? It says that his angels, he'll send them down to you so that not even your toe won't even touch a stone on the ground. Nothing will happen. You're the Messiah. And then he takes them and shows them all the kingdoms of the earth. And he says, if you'll but bend the knee and worship me, I'll give you everything your heart has ever desired. That's right. Jesus was tempted. And you see it even later in his life. Not too long before this scene in the garden. As again, he predicts his upcoming passion, his suffering, his betrayal, and his death. Right after Peter even makes that great proclamation, what does he say? He says, truly, you are the Son of God. And then Peter says, yes. Or Jesus says, yes, Peter, but I have news for you. I'm going to be betrayed, I must suffer, and I must die at the hands of the chief priests. And Peter says, no, never. Over my dead body, that'll never happen, Jesus. And what does Jesus say? Peter, you're in league with Satan here. It is Satan operating through you in what you're saying, trying to stop me from doing that which I must do and going to the cross. Get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're saying, Peter. And that's the whole point. Why was Satan trying so hard from the outset of his ministry to stop Jesus from going to the cross and to take his life early? You know why? I think it's because he had an idea of what Jesus would accomplish on the cross. No, he's not omniscient. No, he's not omnipresent. But you can bet that during Jesus' earthly life and ministry, though God can be in all places at all times in time and space, Satan only won. What more important place for him to be during those 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry than dogging his every step, listening to what he's saying, reading the Old Testament scriptures, hearing Jesus unpack and interpret the prophetic scriptures pointing to the Messiah, the Anointed One, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 who would bear the sins of many and make many righteous. I think he knew. And he's desperately trying to do everything he can to stop Jesus from going to the cross. And you can bet, just as he was in the garden with the first Adam in Genesis 3, tempting him, surely he is here present with Jesus in the garden with the second, the new and better Adam, trying to do everything he can to tempt him and to get him to disobey God and fall into sin. Absolutely. And again, Jesus here, he's praying that the cup would pass. This is an honest prayer. That is exactly how he's feeling in that moment. This is a real prayer. He's debating if for a second the very thing which he came down from heaven to earth to do, if there's another way, if this cup might pass. And it's normal for us to do the same. He understands that proclivity too. How many times have you been in the throes of suffering, in the furnace of suffering, and it hurts, whether it's your body that's broken down, whether you're about to lose a loved one, a spouse, a child, a grandson, a friend, maybe it's horrific anxiety that is crippling you and debilitating you, that you can't go on living the normal kind of life that you want to live. And in those moments, you cry out to God, even as Jesus does, and that's normal, and we follow in his footsteps, and we say, God, please, I can't take this suffering any longer. This pain is unbearable. Would you please take this cup away from me? I can't handle it anymore. I'm coming to the end of my human power. Take this cup. And that's okay. And Jesus gets that too. He did the same thing. But what's important and critical here, first, is that Jesus, he snaps himself out of it. And we must too. That in those moments, though he wants us to come to him with our sufferings, with the burdens and pains of our heart, and to pour them out to him in supplication and in faith, asking him for divine strength to go through it. In the end, we say, just like Jesus did, yet not what I will, but what you will, Father. That's the key. That in those moments of human frailty and finitude, when we come to the end of our human limitations, and we're broken, and we've got nothing left, we snap ourselves out of it, and we realign our will with the divine will of God and say, like Jesus does at the end of verse 36, yet not what I will, but what you will. Despite everything he knows is going to happen, and he well knows as God just how horrific what's going to happen is going to be for him, he relents. He realigns his will to the divine will of God. And he obeys perfectly. That's another thing we need to know and take hold of. We emphasize a lot, and rightfully so, the cross, the resurrection. This is key. What happened on the cross was a real transaction, a real exchange. It was Jesus taking the weight of sinners, all those who would ever come to him in faith, the elect of God, and he completely takes the punishment for their sin, and he completely satisfies the penalty that God's holy justice and righteousness demands for their sin, and God the Father proves that he accepts his sacrifice in the place of sinners by raising him up on the third day, and this is critical. But it is not just the death of Christ in your place that you get when you come to him by faith. Did you know that? It's the perfect, active, obedient life of Christ in your place. That was critical also. The theologians call this his active obedience, right? On the cross, it's his passive obedience. He willingly lays down his life. Nobody takes it from him. Remember John 10? Jesus is not a victim here. Though if anyone ever had a right to exercise a victim mentality, it would be him, because he was sinless, spotless, the Lamb of God without blemish. And yet he never took up his right. And yet every moment too, when the chief priests are spitting at him, mocking him, hurling false accusations at his trial, he had every right to take up his right and even to annihilate them all, including as he's hanging on the cross and they're taunting him. He could have came down and wiped them all out, but he didn't, because he's not a victim, because he did it willingly. He laid his life down. No human being, not the forces of hell, not even Satan has the power to take that away from him. He is God, and he laid it down. But he also lived the perfect life. And that's his active obedience. You need that too. Because it was our sin that disobeyed God's law that prompted the punishment and penalty due for that disobedience and necessitated a sacrifice. And yet he obeys perfectly, humbly. And the story continues. Look at verse 37. And after this intense prayer session, he comes back. If he's sweating blood, I'd imagine his tunic has some blood stains on it mixed with sweat. He must look incredibly distraught. And he comes back, and you see an example of the human weakness and limitation and finitude and even inability to actively obey and have the human will aligned with God. Look at what he catches the disciples doing. He catches them sleeping, no pun intended. Came to them, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." He's saying, Peter, 1 hour. 1 hour you couldn't watch. After all your talk back there as we're walking to the garden, you couldn't stay awake and watch and be alert and pray for 1 hour with me, Peter, and the other two. And then he commands them to do it again. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. That's the key. You want to be able to resist temptation? You need to be watchful. You need to be faithful. You need to be prayerful. You need to be alert. You need to be awake, to have your senses about you, to understand that the flesh is weak and you need the Spirit of God to help you. And in order for him to help you, you need to ask him. Pray, he says. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And he goes off again. Verse 39, he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And now it's almost like they're embarrassed. They're caught a second time. He comes back, and they're asleep, and their eyes are heavy. They're rolling their eyes. The idea is, like some of you sometimes on Sundays when I'm preaching, I see some of y'all dozing off a little bit. Like, you can't stay awake, not even for an hour. I understand, Jesus, what this is like. It's frustrating. Stay awake for an hour, for Pete's sake, Peter. And these are grown men. It's embarrassing. They don't even know what to say because they're caught. These are grown men. I know they had a long and luxurious Passover meal from 6 p.m. to 12 a.m., and now it's probably 2 or 3 in the morning. Yeah, they're tired. But nevertheless, grown men. Grown men to whom Jesus has been ministering and teaching and discipling and even telling them that his death is impending. Just a few hours ago, he told them at the table, one is going to betray him, and then on the way, he says, all of you are going to abandon me. That should be front and center in their minds, wondering like, man, no, I'm staying awake for this. It's not going to be me. Nope. They're out cold. They can barely keep their eyes open. And then he comes back a third time, verse 41, and says to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. He's saying, you're still asleep? Maybe he's even laughing to himself at this point, chuckling. It's enough. You missed your chance to stay awake, to be watchful. to prove the superior faith that you thought you had compared to the rest. No, the time is here. My betrayer is here. And he's going to turn me over to the hands of sinners, saying, rise, get up. He's here. He's here. And there are a lot of ironies in this passage. Jesus prays to be delivered from death. Instead, he will be delivered through death and glorified by the resurrection. Jesus knows that he will not be delivered from the cup, but will be delivered into the hands of sinners. Jesus is delivered by Judas to sinners, but also by God for sinners. And though Jesus feels most alienated from God's presence, he is in fact closest to God's will. Adam surrendered to temptation in the garden and disobeyed God. Jesus resisted temptation and perfectly obeyed God. And he submits to God's will in perfect obedience as the example par excellence for us to follow. And the garden is the prelude to the cross. Because on a hillside, outside of the city, Jesus allows his soul to be crushed to death. And on a hill above the city, he will soon surrender his body to be crucified to death.